Welcome to the Sun, to the solar system. It's an honor to be here today with you to introduce this second highlight lecture to be given by Professor Roger Maurice Bonnet. So it's a pleasure because I have the occasion to meet him at different moments of my own career, and in particular in subjects related to the Sun and the solar system. So Roger Bonnet obtained his PhD at Paris University, pioneering the first solar ultraviolet studies, making use of balloons, rockets, satellites. He was involved in the first French space astronomy mission and also obtained the first UV solar images from the French experiment. And he achieved his PhD in very interesting years in 1968. Soon after, he became the director of Laboratoire de Physique Stellaire et Planétaire. That was a laboratory in ancient fortress in the middle of a forest in the suburbs of Paris, where actually I met him for the first time when I was looking for a PhD topic. And he was in his office with a lot of books and experiments. And he told me, okay, these are images we obtained from a sounding rocket. That's your PhD topic. Be careful, this is worth a few million of that time. Take care of them, but you can analyze them. And so I started within my PhD making use of some of these images which were obtained with a sounding rocket that was launched in collaboration between the Lockheed Palo Alto Research Laboratory and the LPSP, Laboratoire de Physique Stellaire et Planétaire. But actually, before I came, he was also instrumental from the 1969 to 1983, where he was director of this laboratory that later became the Institut d'Astrophysique Spatiale, IS, when it was moved to maybe a less exotic place close to the university campus, on the university campus of Orsay, where now the IS is. But still in LPSP, Professor Bonnet achieved also a number of firsts. For instance, winning a competition to have a French experiment on a very competitive call on the orbiting solar observatories series from the US, also developing a number of experiments on balloon, sounding rockets. And he was also involved in, he was responsible for the telescope that was put on board the Giotto Halley multicolor camera experiment. That's where I lost a bit track of him even. So he moved to ESA, he became the director of science at ESA in 1983. And there, I think he made a huge impact on our program. He collected ideas from the whole community, all stakeholders, and from this consensus he built an architecture of a program, Space Science Horizon 2000, and it took this opportunity together with the community to achieve an increase of the monetary science program budget of 5% until 1996. And thanks to this effort and together with the community and also with industry that were involved that adhere to this program, that as they were challenged, we had a number of science missions. So he has been involved in Giotto, Hipparcos, the Hubble Space Telescope, Ulysses, Huygens, as part of the Cassini-Huygens collaboration, the Infrared Space Observatory. So he was involved as a first proponent of a mission when he was still at the LPSP, but that later became integrated in the SOL cluster investigation. Under his leadership at ESA, also we had XMM Newton. We had also the cluster launched. And I want to remind you that this was not an easy road because he has managed cluster 1 and cluster 2. And as you know, it was under his leadership that he found also the arguments to get the funding to launch cluster 2 as a commitment to the community that had been participating to cluster. And under his directorship, also ESA started the activities for Integral, Rosetta, FIRST, that later became FIRST Herschel, Planck, Mars Express, another example where after the Mars 96 failure, we had a response and a solidarity with our Russian colleagues, international colleagues, to invent Mars Express together with the community. Also, he started NGST, that a bit later was called JWST, Gaia, Solar Orbiter, and also a preparation for LISA. So you see a large number of missions, and but it's not only about project, it's also about people, leadership. He was a leader of people, very critical. So when you had a review to go in front of him, it was very tough. He would always find the hidden mistake or the difficulty, and I think that we are very happy that he applied that also to his relation to the industry and to all the projects. Then, as it was not enough, in May 1997, when he was still director of science, he was given the mandate by the Director General of ESA to develop a new program, an Earth observation program, a so-called envelope program called Living Planet, and for which now we have a set of missions, Earth Explorers and then Earthwatch mission, almost every year. Now that's his legacy. Eventually, Professor Bonnet retired from ESA, and then he returned to CNES where he was in 2002, the Director General Adjoint in charge of science. And he also became the president of COSPAR, and we have here some colleagues from COSPAR with us that have been working with him. I think in this room, who has not had to deal with Professor Bonnet in his career? So he was president of COSPAR from 2002 to 2010. And now he's executive director at the International Space Science Institute. He had a large number of medals. I wanted to mention the Gagarin Medal for some of our Russian friends, recognition of the highest level from the International Academy of Astronautics. So it's a pleasure on behalf of the International Astronautical Federation and the International Academy of Astronautics to introduce my dear friend and also my supervisor, Roger Maurice Bonnet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Thank you for being here tonight and listening to this exposé on the sun and discovering with me the marvels of our star. This speech will be illustrated by some remarkable pictures taken from missions all around the world, and I will right away start by showing the next one, which is obtained with the Solar Dynamic Observatory of NASA and shows the sun, which is supposed to be spherical. At least this was a model which I had to use when I made my computations for the thesis. Let's assume the sun is a sphere. And if you look at the sun in X-rays, you see how it looks like. So how many mistakes you can make by using the wrong model. Well, anyway, what I was looking for was not this type of thing, so the model was okay. And this is in fact how the sun looks like this morning at 8 o'clock UT. So it's really spherical, so you can, in the first attempt to describe the sun, think that it is spherical. It is a little bit oblate at the equator, but it's certainly a very close approximation to a sphere. You can see a few sunspots on the right-hand side of the sun, on the disk, which I will comment later during my exposé. reasons why we study the sun are many. But before explaining that, I wanted to show you how the sun looked like to our ancestors back in the past, and how it looked like when Galileo used his small telescope, Il Canocchiale, for the first time in 1610, excuse me. But the sun looked like to our ancestors like that, essentially. They had no telescope to observe it until Galileo invented his Canocchiale, and only during eclipses and with good glasses or during sun-sun storms you could see the sun as we see it today during an eclipse when the moon is in front of the disk. And this is how Galileo looked at the sun. Can you imagine this telescope, approximately 90 centimeters in length, with a length of a diameter of maybe 2 centimeters. He has to follow the sun because there is no mechanism to follow the sun. At the same time, he has to take a pencil, took a paper, and draw what he is seeing because there is no plate, no detector, no CCD. And the drawing that you see on the right are exactly what he saw. And he was a man who, for the first time, looked at the disk and discovered sunspots on the disk, which created for him a little trouble with the church, because the sun was not considered anymore as something which is stable and quiet. The sun was considered to be active, and the activity of the sun was not very much favored by the church. So why do we study the sun? Well, because it's our star. It's the nearest star, and it's also the object of the solar system, which represents 99.86% of its mass. So it's worth the trouble to look at it. And it is also the most powerful nuclear fusion factory that we have in the solar system. A nuclear fusion factory which provides us with all the renewable energies. Sorry for the ecologists, but all renewable energies are created by fusion. That's a thing which you may not like, but it's a fact. And the sun is also still mysterious, as you will see. There are a few things that we still do not understand and that we would like to understand, and I will dwell on a few of them, which are still a little mysterious, and some which have been become more easy to understand. So, 80 years ago, the sun was looking like this. We could only see the sun, but we had no idea of what was inside the sun. We did not know what was the source of the light of the sun 80 years ago. We did not know why the sun was shining. People were thinking that the sun was shrinking on itself, and the gravity energy falling at the center of the sun was creating the light. The lifetime of the sun was considered to be like the age of the universe, a few million years, and we know today that this is wrong, because today we have the ability to look inside the sun, as I will explain to you, and we have the ability to understand, thanks to this man that you see on the solar disk, Einstein, who showed that the equivalent of energy and mass are related by the famous equation E equal mc squared. And in the side of the sun, which is made essentially of hydrogen and helium, the 4 atoms of hydrogen are fusing to make an atom of helium. In this chemical and radioactive thermonuclear reaction, the mass of the helium that you create, atom that you create, is 0.7% less than the mass of the 4 hydrogen atoms. Therefore, you lose mass in the reaction. But where does this mass go? It goes into light. So at the center of the sun, you have a big fusion factory which creates light. And it takes 1 million years for one photon created at the center of the sun to get outside. So you can imagine that the fluctuations of what happened in the center of the sun do not affect very much the light of the sun, and therefore the stability of the sun is really linked to this enormous mass and the difficulty for light to travel and to be transmitted from the center to the limb of the sun. But inside the sun, when you go closer to the surface is cooler than the center, the core of the sun. the atoms of hydrogen and helium essentially become more neutral, and they absorb light. So light cannot escape anymore, and therefore it's like a pan in which you have put water. The sun is bubbling, and you see that at the surface of the sun, where you see the granulation, and you will see beautiful pictures of that in the exposé. So this is essentially the mechanism which creates the light of the sun, fusion reaction, and it was a long time before we could understand how this light was conveyed to the outside and why the sun was so active in its various manifestations. So the power of space observations became clear during a period just following the First World War, and the people who lived in Paris at that time could hear 120 kilometers far away from Paris the Pariser Kanonen, who was called also the Big Bertha, was the name of another cannon, but this one had a 30-meter long launching tunnel, and it was in this in such an object that German physicist Otto Kiepenheuer, Karl Otto Kiepenheuer, decided to put a spectrometer to look whether the sun was emitting light other than in the visible spectrum of the sun. So he put an experiment in this cannon, and of course the result that the machine went up to 90 kilometers because it was erected toward the sun, and the direction, in the vertical direction. Of course, there was no parachute, and when the instrument came back, it was, in fact, like my first experiment, which I wrote exactly, splashed on the ground and nothing was left. I don't know if he cried like I cried when I saw that for my experiment, but I think he was not discouraged, because in space there is one motto that you have always to keep in mind: never give up. So I never give up, and he did not, because also he used this V2 rocket, but the same thing occurred, except that it was not him who launched the rocket for the first time, but two American scientists, because when this rocket was ready, he himself was probably not in very good situation in Germany, and von Braun escaped to the United States after the war with about 120 of these rockets. And it's thanks to Herb Friedman and Richard Towsey from the Naval Research Laboratory that the first picture of the sun and the first spectra of the sun in the ultraviolet were obtained across the Atlantic. This is a spectrum of the sun. You see the quality. There was no CCD, there was no other detector than photographic plates, and therefore it's poor quality, but at least it was the first time that we could see that the sun had an ultraviolet spectrum in the short wavelength range. This is a Véronique rocket, which is the French version of the V2, and this is thanks to this rocket that, in fact, I also tried to do the same thing as the two gentlemen that you saw, and Professor Kiepenheuer also. And I launched this rocket 5 times from the Sahara Desert and obtained my PhD after 3 successful flights of this rocket and 2 big failures. It was absolutely fun, a lot of sweat and a lot of trouble. And this is the way, as Bernard recalled, that in 1968 I got my PhD in this context. I was writing my PhD during the night, and during the day I was fighting with these guys. And the next picture shows you somebody who looks like me, I was told, but it's not me. It's Daniel Cohn-Bendit discussing with a policeman and joking with him, but the policeman is, of course, strict. And this is exactly what I had to do in 1968 to give my PhD to the administration of the University of Paris, which was closed and surrounded by a lot of this police. And if I had not given my PhD, my manuscript of the PhD to the administration of the university before a certain date and a certain time, I could not get my PhD. Therefore, I asked a policeman who was in front of the gate of the university, please, could you give my PhD manuscript to the administration? He said, what is that? I said, well, it's my PhD, it's my future, please help me. I will not do any damage during this time, please help me. So he agreed, and thanks to police, I got my PhD on the 19th of July 1968, which is fairly unusual because everything is closed normally. But in 1968, paradoxically, the university was opened for PhD students. So that was a fascinating time, and it's a lesson for the young people: never give up, even in front of the police. So let's go back to the sun for some time and again look at the power of space observations. Space observations allow you to look above the atmosphere, and therefore the whole spectrum is observed. But the sun has the ability to be a strong emitter of X-ray radiation, because the sun is hot, very hot in the outer layers, and I will explain you the paradox of this. So if you look at the sun during an eclipse, this is what you see. An unusual object in the sky appears where the moon masks the disk of the sun and let appear the corona, and the little red ribbon that you see around the sun is called the chromosphere, because it has a color. And it is just the layers of gas which are above the limb of the sun. So, if you look at the disk, the average temperature of the solar disk is about 5,750 degrees, which is the reason why the sun looks a little bit yellow. This is the color of a black body at this temperature. If you look at other wavelength and the white light, which you see with your eyes, in the X-rays, you see the corona above the disk, because the corona is hot and emits light above the disk of the sun. This is how the corona and the chromosphere look like at 80,000 degrees, how it looks like at 1.3 million degrees in the soft X-ray regime. And the harder the X-rays you use to image the sun, the higher the temperature. And you can look at light emitted by very ionized ions like iron 11, and of course this image from the Yohkoh Japanese satellite shows that you can see light above 2 million degrees. So we have also, with the space experiments, the ability to probe the depth of the sun or the altitude of the sun and make slices of images of this wonderful star. So I want to tell you a little thing about what Bernard mentioned. He explained the SOHO experiment. It's true that in the early 80s in Europe we wanted to use the continuity of observations by using a satellite which would be in orbit at Lagrangian point 1 between the Sun and the Earth Moon system, in order to have observations to look continuously at the Sun. So we developed the concept of several of these missions. One previous incarnation of this mission was called DISCO, a spinning satellite, very simple and probably too simple to be part of the ESA program. But some of solar physicists decided to propose a SOHO mission, which was a satellite in orbit around Lagrangian point 1, 1.5 million kilometers from the Sun, and was able, in rotation, in orbit around the Sun, and to be in constant light, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and 365 days per year, looking at the Sun. And there was no possibility to make an eclipse on SOHO, because the Sun was always behind you. So if you wanted to make an eclipse of the Sun, you had to create it yourself. So this is why SOHO was using 3 coronagraphs, which are instruments which mask the image of the disk of the Sun and let the radiation from the corona go through. And this was indeed a great achievement, and the coronagraph on SOHO are all operating at this moment. So this SOHO instrument was the first big solar instrument launched in the world after the last NASA instrument, the Solar Maximum mission, which I think accomplished its duties in the early 80s. So between the launch of the SOHO mission in 1995 and the 1980s, the early 80s, there was no solar mission at all. Only rockets, the rocket mentioned by Bernard, and only small rockets. Good experiments, but no big solar mission. So SOHO was the first one. And so we were so determined in Europe to do it that we even attracted NASA to cooperate with us. And this has created a real revolution, as you will see. I will mention that to you in a few moments, but let me tell you why SOHO was so extraordinary in its achievements. SOHO has had the ability, by observing the sun continuously, to do what we call helioseismology. That is to say, to use the motions due to turbulence and acoustic waves in the solar body, and which create a lot of waves, which you see on the right-hand side. They are reflected at the surface of the sun, and depending upon their spatial frequency, they can go close to the surface or go deep inside the sun. And by measuring the frequency of these waves, you can determine the temperature of the sun, an average temperature of the layer that they explore, and the chemical composition of the sun. And SOHO has done that remarkably well, and has in fact established this power spectrum, which shows the keyboard of the sun, if you want, on the right, where you see all these wonderful frequencies so nicely aligned. Sun is a body of dust and gas and so on, and it is remarkable that you can create this spectrum, and this spectrum is in fact the key to inferring what happened inside the sun. And what happened inside the sun is absolutely remarkable. First of all, SOHO was using these frequencies to look at the possible internal rotation of the sun. The sun in the radiative zone, before it reaches convective motions, is rotating like a body, a solid body, like a ball of pétanque for the French people. And this solid body, in fact, when we reach the convective zone, is showing some differential rotation, which I will mention. SOHO was able to probe the entire solid body of the sun, nearly to 10% of the radius from the core. So it was really a seismograph for the sun. And thanks to this ability, we were able to measure the velocity, as you can see here, between 75% of the radius down to 0.22 or 25% to the center. And the measurements have been continuing. Now this is an old picture, but they are continuing, but there is still some question mark when you reach to the center, because the waves that go to the center have very small amplitude, only a fraction of a millimeter per second in frequency. It's very difficult to measure. So the next missions in space will have to look at this and really probe the deep center of the sun. But the thing which is interesting is that when you arrive at 75%, the sun does not rotate anymore like a solid body. The velocity is depending upon the latitude of the layers that you look at. At 75 degrees, the sun rotates much more slowly than at the equator. And this was a phenomenon that we could see while looking at the sun and the motions of the spots on the sun, but we could now follow from the surface down to the convective zone the differential rotation and see that all these curves were converging at the bottom of the convective zone, which is called the tachocline, the region where, in fact, it is assumed that the solar interior hosts the solar dynamo, which creates the magnetic field of the sun. The other thing that SOHO has done at that time, the solar physicist and the physicists were struggling to see whether we could explain the difference in the number of neutrinos created during the fusion reaction inside the sun, which were 1/3 the number of neutrinos that should have been emitted by the sun. What we measured on the ground was 1/3, and a big 1/3 which could be measured with great accuracy. The mystery was essentially two explanations. Either the neutrinos were not behaving like we expected, or the sun, the model of the sun that we were using was not the right one, and the sun was producing less neutrinos than expected. So SOHO, thanks to its ability to look at the sun, was able, inside the sun, was able to compare the model of the sun with the real measurements. And to do that, we compared the velocity of sound inside the sun for the solar model and for the measurements made by various experiments, including the Gong and the Virgo and the MDI observations made by SOHO. And you see the differences between these various curves is very, very small. It's about 2 × -3, 2000s. Of course, at the level of the convective zone, which is difficult to represent, you can see that there are some divergences, but again, you look at the amplitude of this variation, it's very small. So the solar model was comforted by these measurements, and it could be said at that time that the neutrino problem could not be explained by variation in the solar model, and that the problem would essentially be with the neutrinos themselves. And it was a time when the physicists at CERN and in other places in the world measure the properties of the neutrinos and realize that the neutrinos could, coming from the sun, which are of one type called the electron neutrinos, could be transformed in two species, the tau and the mu neutrinos, which the detectors on the sun could not measure. Suddenly, light came in the face of the solar physicists and of the physicists themselves. The explanation was given. Today, the solar model is again put in discussion because the abundances that are used to compute the velocity of sound inside the sun depends on measurements of abundances which are made in several places, in particular at Liège by Nicolas Graves, and apparently the new abundances are not in line with the standard model, but this does not affect the measurements which were made for the neutrinos. So this was the explanation given. The neutrinos were responsible. I was talking about the revolution created by SOHO. In fact, SOHO was launched in 1995, operating in early 1996. 10 years later, Japan launched the Hinode mission, which will be illustrated by a few nice pictures and movies in this presentation. In 2006, a beautiful instrument. Of course, better than SOHO. You don't have to develop new instruments if they're not better than the previous one. It's not like electing the president of your nation or the prime minister. You don't know what you get. But in space, you have to always to be better, and this is the case here. NASA also in 2006 launched this fantastic set of spacecraft which looked at the sun with two eyes, like we do look at the universe with our eyes. And these two eyes are two satellites, absolutely identical, put in orbit around the sun. On the Earth's orbit, one is preceding the Earth, the other one is receding the Earth, and you see here the various dates at which indicate where the satellites were in 2007, 2008, 2009. Presently, they are at this position. One is looking at the sun nearly a little bit behind the sun, the other one also a little bit behind the sun. And with SDO, the other satellite, the SDO, looking at the center of the sun, you have a 3D observation of the sun. It's absolutely remarkable, and you will see what it can achieve in a few minutes. And I talk about SDO, the Solar Dynamic Observatory. It's a super SOHO. It's a SOHO much better than SOHO in terms of resolution, in terms of capacity of data transmission, in terms of storage, in terms of number of wavelengths and telescopes that you have on board. But it was launched in 2010. And you see this accumulation of satellites in less than 4 years, Hinode 2006, Stereo 2006, SDO 2010, and between the end of SMM in 1980 and the launch of SOHO in 1995, nothing. So I think SOHO has really created the revolution, showing to the scientists all around the world and the space agencies that it was a good concept and it should be repeated. Well, the other revolution which I found absolutely flabbergasting is that just 2 years after the launch of SOHO, NASA decided to develop, together with Lockheed, a small satellite called TRACE, which was looking at the upper layers of the Sun. It was a small satellite of the Explorer category. The cost of this mission was about 50 million, according to the numbers which are quoted by NASA, maybe a little bit better if you add the cost of the launch. And they made these beautiful pictures, these instruments which were better than SOHO at a cost which was approximately a factor of 5, essentially cheaper than SOHO was. And the most extraordinary one, I think, is this one, which was made by our friends from a nation which is very strange, I must say. It's a nation which has a king, of course, but the people is the king of the people, but not the king of the nation. They can work without a government for 1.5 years. They find, and in that condition, they can find money to be the 4th or 5th member state of ESA among the smaller ones, the biggest funding small member state of ESA. And they created this mission, which I think is absolutely unique. It's better than SOHO. It has a bigger field. It cost only 18 million without the cost of the launch. But the launcher was cheap. It was, I think, a Russian launcher, if I'm not wrong. And I would like to say that thanks to my friend Pierre Rochus here, we have this type of instrument. Unfortunately, it came a little bit late, but it shows that based on experience and on new technologies, you can really create this type of remarkable achievements. And I think we should really say thank you to our Belgian colleagues. In fact, ESA is also involved in this mission and operates it as helped Belgium to develop it. So let's go to the delicate aspect of the Sun, which is a source of all our trouble, the magnetic field. The Sun is magnetic and variable, and this is because the Sun has a dynamo in the interior of its volume, and this dynamo is the source of all the manifestations. Here is a nice picture of the surface of the Sun. I said the Sun is like a boiling pan, and you see the bubbles of this pan at the surface called the granulation. Each of these grains about the distance between Brussels and Marseille, or 700 kilometers. And you see here two manifestations of the presence of a magnetic field on the surface. You have two dark areas here. We have small sunspots, what we call Boltzmann spots. You have seen sunspots at the beginning. And if your eyes are good enough, you can see that the granulation does not behave the same way between these two sunspots. You see some kind of aligned structures, which show that something happens. In fact, sunspots are big manifestations of the presence of a magnetic field. You see here a sunspot. The images are taken by the Swedish Space Telescope in Canary Island. On the still picture here, you see a sunspot, and you see the size of a sunspot as compared to the size of the Earth. So you can see that the Earth is a little bit smaller than a sunspot. So a sunspot is about 6,000 to 7,000 kilometers, but you have a big group of things here, and you could see the dynamic of the sunspot. This is interesting. So using helioseismology, you can essentially find what is underneath a sunspot, because people before observing sunspot did not know whether these were big phenomena or just superficial little pastels on the face of the Sun. And thanks to helioseismology and our friend from the Lockheed Palo Alto Research Laboratory, we were able to dive underneath a sunspot and look at the variation of temperature underneath the sunspot, which you can measure by the variation in frequency of the acoustic waves. And you can see that the sunspot goes a little bit less deep than its diameter. So it's a very superficial phenomenon. Even though the root of the sunspot might be underneath, the effect of the sunspot on the environment are essentially very, very small, which shows also that, in fact, the sunspots are dark because they are cooler than the surrounding of the sun. The pressure of the gas is smaller because the magnetic field exerts the pressure by itself and counterbalances the pressure of the gas. So the sunspot is darker because it is cooler. And it is remarkable that also with the space instruments we can see what is above the sunspot, because the sunspot is at the surface of the sun, but as I told you, there is a chromosphere and a corona above the limb of the sun. So above the sunspot, this is how the sun looks like. The sunspot is at the center of this turmoil here, and you see that thanks to high energy observations in the ultraviolet and in the X-rays, the sunspot is not anymore dark but bright in the X-rays. So with space observations we can really make some kind of not only stereoscopy but endoscopy of the structures of the sun from the interior to the external parts of the sun. So this is also a remarkable element. But this magnetic field exerts a lot of pressure on the gas in the solar corona. The solar corona is hot, as I explained to you, and I will discuss this in a moment. But it's hot, and therefore also it's very tenuous. The pressure of the gas is several orders of magnitude, 1 million times smaller than the pressure inside the body of the sun. Therefore, the magnetic field, which has a pressure by itself and exerts forces, can sculpt and give to the gas its very strange shapes. And you will see a few examples of that. This is one picture taken not long ago, I think at the beginning of August, of what is called a filament. A filament is looks dark on the disk because it's cooler, but when it goes outside the sun, it's brighter because there is no light outside of the sun, no bright light, and therefore the gas which is trapped into this magnetic loop, it's a big magnetic loop essentially, which joins two polarity, north and south, between two sunspots, creates this big phenomenon here. And you can see several examples of that obtained with the Solar Dynamic Observatory. These prominences are when they explode the source of what we call coronal mass ejections, and you will see an example of that. Another beautiful example, another beautiful and frightening example of what the violence of the sun is. So the sun also sometimes, because of magnetic reconnection between different configuration of the magnetic field and the polarities which exchange between north and south polarities, emits big explosions of gas. And you see one of these explosions which have been tracked by the SOHO mission sometimes in, I think, 1998, just a few times before SOHO stopped for a while. And you see that when such an explosion, the sun is rotating much slower than that, so at some time an explosion occurs in the sun, it ejects particles in the direction of the Earth and of SOHO, and SOHO detectors are blinded and they are full of noise because of the particles. So this is another manifestation of the magnetic field. And another image taken by the coronagraph of SOHO, where the central disk is essentially masking the sun, the disk of the sun, and you see that suddenly a big explosion occurs. The little fellows that you can see here, like little fish, are two comets which are turning around the sun. They are not the cause of the big eruption, but they are just there and they disappear probably somewhere inside the sun. There are many of them. SOHO has been the biggest discoverer of comets, I think, in the history, with probably around 1,000 comets discovered, with amateurs using internet and the pictures of SOHO on the internet. So CMEs, coronal mass ejections, are really dangerous elements, and you will see at the end of the talk how we can protect ourselves against these things, because they can create big perturbations. They send into space billions of tons of gas and particles, which essentially reach all the planets, including the Earth. So, I talk about the corona, but I want to show you that we also have made some progress in understanding this very curious phenomenon, which is illustrated here. Here you have a diagram which shows the distance to the sun from the center to the outside, and you see on the vertical axis the temperature of the sun from several million degrees to the surface. So like in normal thermodynamic theory, this hot body, which is called the sun, cools down thanks to the second principle of thermodynamics, and then reaches the surface, where, as you have seen, the temperature is about 5,700 degrees, while at the interior it's 15 million degrees, and this is why and how the fusion reaction can be initiated. Can you imagine a nuclear machine made of dust and gas, which has taken, of course, 1 billion years to be built? It takes, in principle, only a few tens of years to build the ITER project in south of France. But of course, it is not so hot, and you have to create hot temperatures. The sun does this with the mass of dust and gas, which is very heavy at the center of the sun, and pushes the gas. In ITER, you have to recreate these conditions with a lot of tricks, and it's not so easy. But at least the sun has invented this machinery. It takes a long time to build, but it's working quite well, I think, as you can see. Suddenly, when you leave the surface, the temperature rises again. It is contrary to all principles of thermodynamics. So something happens, which is essentially that there must be somewhere in the sun a source of energy which is dissipated in the corona and heats the corona to temperatures which can reach, as I showed you a little earlier, temperature of 2 million degrees or even sometimes more, but it's of this order. So what is the cause of this? This mystery has been with us since the discovery that the corona was hot in 1937, the date when I was born, and I was living with no explanation of the hot corona since I was born. This is frustrating, and of course, if you want to justify a good experiment in space, you have to say that you will solve the mystery of the hot corona. Everybody has done that, and we are making progress, but it's not yet solved, as you will see. Nevertheless, we are focusing now on several reasons for creating a hot corona out of a cold surface. One of them is to use this reconnection of magnetic fields in small areas, like flares, small flares of or small active regions, which dissipate energy stored in the magnetic field in the corona. How this dissipation hits the corona is not completely clear. And recently there has been two progress in one direction, which is essentially to look at the propagation of waves. And there are two types of waves which have been considered. One are the waves discovered by Alfvén, and which are essentially waves which travel in horizontal deformation of the magnetic field lines. This is a beautiful movie taken by the Japanese Hinode satellite, which shows the spicules. There is something that you can see with the invisible instruments on the ground, but with an instrument in space you have no fluctuations of the atmosphere. Everything is beautiful and calm, and you can see these spicules, and you can measure their motions. And this was done by the SDO. They follow these spicules with Hinode, and they take pictures a little above the spicules and see waves which are essentially moving in the spicules. This was discovered. These waves were discovered and invented, excuse me, by Hans Alfvén, who got the Nobel Prize for this. You see him on the left here, and the SDO mission has been able to see the deformation of structures, and you see this little Z type of or C type of structures on the SDO images here and here, and they have been analyzed, and they have been shown that these waves carry enough energy from the bottom of the solar atmosphere to the upper atmosphere in the 171 angstrom channel, which is at the corona level. They have a frequency of about 100 seconds, something like that, sometimes 500 seconds, and they have a velocity of 24 kilometers per second, and this transferred into energy is providing enough energy to hit the corona at the temperature that we see. So this is the first example of the power of space observation to explain this phenomena. How these waves are generated and how they dissipate their energy is still a part of the mystery which has not been explained. Similarly, recently appeared in the literature another discovery, I pass on this rapidly, which was that you could see magnetic tornadoes which were created and visible at the surface of the sun in the near ultraviolet using the light of calcium, ionized calcium, which is formed at just a little bit above the surface of the sun, and these swirls of gas can be followed by the various images taken by the SDO mission at various altitudes up to the top of the chromosphere and the corona, and they create structures. So there is clearly an effect of these tornadoes, which are like big tornadoes in the sun, and that also has a relation with the emission of light in the corona. So there is clearly there also an explanation which needs to be confirmed by future observations. This is where we are. So we are 74 years after the discovery of the hot corona, and we are still not yet able to explain why it is so hot, but we have at least narrowed the field of possibilities to just a few of them. So this is progress, but you can still justify your future solar mission by saying that you will solve the mystery of the hot corona. Good news for those who want to follow that. Now we enter something absolutely new and beautiful, which is a discovery made by our colleagues from the Lockheed Palo Alto laboratory in California, who are responsible for the Solar Dynamic Observatory. They have followed continuously in the orbit of the SDO mission the fluctuations of brightness on the sun. And you can see the sun is brightening, and it looked completely disordered. But these guys have been saying, well, maybe there is some order in this chaos, and they have looked at it. And of course, they have many tools for that, because this is one image at, I think, 171 angstroms, which is far in the X-ray domain, at a temperature of nearly 1.7 million degrees. They also looked a little bit underneath, and in the light of the helium, ionized helium, the same phenomenon simultaneously observed, and you see again these clouds of matter at the upper part of this image, which escape because it's a big eruption. It's a coronal mass ejection. They ejected billions of tons of material. They choked a lot of system on the Earth. It was in August 2010. And they used these observations to try to modelize what happened. And their idea was that these things happened not simultaneously, but are all linked to the same triggering phenomenon. So the global magnetic field perturbations, are not just local, they are also global. And they made some models, and I'll show you one of these models, and you will see how the sun behaves, and look at the magnetic field lines that they have rebuilt. And that's very big distance from one of the major sunspots that you can see here, which is probably the source of all these perturbations. You see the magnetic field lines, which are connecting to another polarity far away from the center, creating a lot of other phenomena. And they have done that for several observations, and they have used for this also the possibility of using the free observations, the stereo B and A, which looks a little bit behind the sun, and what happens with SDO. And you can see that some of these magnetic field lines recognize far away, and you can see them just like little insects or animals or worms connecting to the other part of the sun. And in that sense, they have been able to rebuild the global magnetic field, and they assure me that this is not coincidence, but it is absolutely deterministic. The perturbation that you see on the whole surface of the sun are connected to one triggering phenomenon at some place. Of course, you have local perturbation, and you have regional perturbation, but certainly the manifestation of solar activities are linked to the total magnetic field of the sun, and they are absolutely associated with these strange manifestations of active regions. So let's go to see the sun activity now, the solar activity, because it's the source of a lot of problems that we see on Earth. Solar activity has been observed for many, many years, but you see one of the most beautiful pictures and movie of the Hinode spacecraft showing how the sun is not a quiet sphere, and if Galileo could see that, the church would definitely condemn him forever and put him in jail. The sun is not quite clear, and it is constantly moving, and here what you see are these little spicules that I showed in the profile earlier, and you see that this is stunning. Now, the sun is active, and we know that since many years. The solar activity is measured by the number of sunspots, an average number of sunspots per a given period of time. And when you count this number of sunspots, you get this diagram, black diagram at the bottom of this curve, which shows that every 11 years on average, it's not always 11, it can be 9, it can be 13, but the number of sunspots increases, and of course varies also in position, in latitude on the solar disk. I will not give you a lesson on that because it's not the purpose of this talk, but what is interesting is that we can observe this cycle now also from space, and thanks to the quality of observation. For example, the SOHO mission observed the sun from 1996-2006 and shows the appearance of the solar corona during minimum and maximum, and you see that in minimum there is very little structure of the sun in 1996. At maximum in 2001, a lot of structures, as seen in this picture of the solar corona in X-rays. The number of coronal mass ejections also varies with the cycle. It's maximum at solar maximum and minimum at solar minimum. Here are several curves which are built with different assumptions on the number, on the manner of counting these CMEs. The solar wind velocity measured by the Ulysses spacecraft, which has the ability to look above the poles of the sun, and is a different animal than all the ones which I mentioned, but unique, absolutely unique. Nobody has replaced this mission, which is a pity. The solar wind velocity, during solar minimum on the left, is very quiet, and you see two regimes, one above the pole here, which is about 800 kilometers per second, and shorter, smaller velocity at the equator. When you go into solar maximum, the solar wind becomes crazy. You see, it doesn't know where to go. It is very high, very short, very high, very short. So we were very lucky that Ulysses was launched during solar minimum, because we have this beautiful picture. So the solar wind in itself also, which I did not talk too much about, but is a great manifestation also of the hot corona, is deeply affected by solar activity. And this is how the cycle of activity looked like in the previous cycle between 95 and 2010, which is exactly the period covered by Louise's, and how it has been modified recently, how it has been rising again since 2010. As you know, solar cycle was creating a lot of questions because it has disappeared and it was not resurrected as fast as it should have been. But in fact, the predictions of the solar wind behavior, of the solar activity, show that the solar activity level is increasing, but at a lower level than the previous cycle. And probably this present cycle is not that active as the previous one. Now, the interesting observations comes from past observations of the solar cycle, which shows that a few years after Galileo observed the sunspots on the sun, if he had done the observations 10 years later, he would have seen nothing, because there was no sunspot on the sun. And this is called the Maunder minimum that you see on the left-hand side of this diagram in red. Sunspot had disappeared. And suddenly, and this was the time of, in France, the reign of the King Sun, Le Roi Soleil, badly named for that reason, because the sun was not so active at that time, apparently, and the sun started to be active again at the end of the 17th century. So it's a remarkable set of observations, but more remarkable is that the sun was still very active during the Maunder minimum. And how do we know that? We know that because we use a proxy measurement, which is the penetration of cosmic rays in the Earth's atmosphere. The penetration of cosmic rays in the Earth's atmosphere is stronger. The number of cosmic rays reaching the top of the atmosphere of the Earth is higher at solar minimum because the magnetic field is quiet and certainly allows the magnetic field, the cosmic rays to penetrate in the atmosphere of the Earth. And when they penetrate into the atmosphere of the Earth, they create isotopes of beryllium-10 and carbon-14, which you can extract from measurements of ice cores in Greenland. And these measurements give you essentially correlation between the number of cosmic rays reaching the Earth and solar activity, and you can see that they are anti-correlated. Smaller the activity, the larger number of cosmic rays, and vice versa. So these measurements have been made, and it was shown by a Swiss scientist, Professor Berg, that during the Maunder minimum that you can see in the central shaded area here, the sun was still active, and by proper analysis and wavelength analysis of these measurements, you can show that in fact there is a periodicity of 11 years in the number of beryllium-10 atoms discovered in these ice cores during the Maunder minimum. So the sun was active, and how is it possible that the sun is active and shows this cycle when there is no sunspot? Well, it's simple. The explanation that the magnetic field has changed. Its configuration is changed. It's not able anymore to create sunspots, but it creates other things. And the things that it creates are these things here, which are these little bright points that you see all around the surface. There is a sunspot in the middle, but you see it's surrounded by small bright points. And these bright points are probably due to small loops of magnetic field. So the sun has not anymore this big dipolar structure, but many multipolar structure, and which creates this brightening of the surface, but also allows the solar wind and the corona to still be very active. At that time, there was no satellites to measure the X-rays and the UV, but certainly we have here an explanation that the Maunder minimum and that the number of sunspots is probably not the best measurement of solar activity. You need probably a better indication of solar activity. And this measurement explains also to you why when you look at the total luminosity of the sun, the white light of the sun, which you measure from Earth or from space, better from space, the sun is brighter when there are more sunspots on the sun. Sunspots are darker, so it's very strange that the sun is brighter when you have more dark areas in the sun. Problem is that when you have more dark areas on the sun, you have also more bright areas on the sun. And the bright areas are competing with the dark areas, sunspots, and create a maximum of intensity during the maximum number of sunspots. You can see here a recomposition of measurements made from space since 1978, with different instruments. The agreement between these measurements is a very tough game for the scientists to perform, but you can see that it is interesting that in fact it is during solar maximum that you have the larger brightness of the sun, and solar minimum the smaller brightness of the sun, which means that when you have more sunspots on the sun is of course brighter, but less bright than if there were no sunspots. So during the Maunder minimum, where there were no sunspots, probably the sun was brighter than it is assumed, which has something interesting to do with the explanations that during the Maunder minimum the sun was so cold that the cold climate and the temperature of northern England, because it was only measured at that time in this area of the world, was so cold. Well, this is another game. We'll talk in my conclusion about this. This is the evolution of also of the variability of the sun in the UV and X-rays, and you can see that the variability is not easy to understand on this graph, but the variability of the sun in the UV, near UV and far UV regime and X-ray regime is much higher, and in fact varies by more than the small percentage of solar constant observations which I have just shown. Let me go back here. The fluctuation of the solar constant here vary between something like 1366 and 1368. So it's only a few fraction of a percent, and it's not very, very significant. So it's very stable. The sun has a luminosity which is very stable. So can we forecast solar activity? Well, you have seen that people with models can forecast solar activity. In order to forecast solar activity, you need to know better what triggers the solar activity, the magnetic field probably, and in order to understand better how the magnetic field behaves for long-term forecasting, you need to go inside the sun and measure the property and the conditions of temperature and velocity of the gas, which are where the dynamo is in fact acting to create the field along the polar axis of the sun. Unfortunately, this is exactly the area where we have no measurements. We have no measurements up to now of the interior of the sun looking down along the polar axis. It's probably the task of the future solar orbiter mission of ESA to start to dive into this area, which is white area of this diagram here, and maybe there we will have a better view on how the motions of gas and magnetic field interact to create the dynamo that we have there. Well, let me conclude by a few words on the solar influences on the Earth. Well, it's well known that the sun influences the Earth. It has been assumed that the sun can have some climatic effect on the Earth's conditions through radiation, total irradiance and spectral irradiance, to particles and cosmic rays penetrating into the atmosphere, being absorbed by the atmosphere and maybe heating the atmosphere, or by geomagnetic perturbations due to the penetration of magnetic perturbations from the sun. In fact, there is poor evidence in the various temperature measurements of the Earth over many decades and centuries that there is the 11-year cycle reproduces itself. So apparently the 11-year cycle is not affecting too much the evolution of the global temperature of the Earth. However, let's see what we know about this problem, which is a very heated problem, creating heated debates in the various communities involved. So let me just summarize what we know about this problem. What we know is that the Earth is getting warmer. This we can measure through the increase in the elevation of the global temperature of the Earth, the global mean temperature of the Earth on the upper diagram. You can see that the average sea level has increased recently, and the little red line that you see here spans the space era. So before that we have some proxy measurements or temperature measurement, but of poor quality. This is why the margin of uncertainty is becoming larger as far as we go back in time. But it's increasing, and it's increasing by 3 millimeters per year, which means that in 1 century it can reach 30 centimeters, which is something that the specialists are debating. And also the ice coverage, the snow cover of the northern hemisphere is going down. It's clearly seen here. And even better on these two pictures, which are pictures of the glaciers which are receding. The glacier Muir in Alaska, photographed here in 1941, and the same glacier with the same point of observation shows the glacier. You see trees have been growing on the right bank of the glacier, and the glacier is now a lake. So the Earth is getting warmer. Nobody can dispute that. There are many manifestations of that. They may not be all connected to the same phenomenon, but it's a fact. So this we know. We know also that the concentration of gas CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing, and these are measurements made beautifully by people in Hawaii, where the atmosphere is fairly pure, so there is no perturbation, and little oscillations that you see are the yearly measurements. When it's warmer, there are more CO2, when it's colder, less, and so you can see that this is very nice. And, you see also the variation of this curve since 2007 and 2012. This increase in CO2 is essentially of anthropogenic nature, and nobody disputes that. So we know that also. We know that the solar constant is varying, but not enough to create big perturbations. However, the UV and X-ray can create perturbation, may create perturbation, because they are fluctuating quite a lot. So these are the summaries of the various factors which may affect the climate. And you see CO2 in red heating the atmosphere for the greenhouse effect, the same for methane, the same for other elements. You see also cooling factors like the albedo and clouds, formation of clouds. But the solar measurements, the solar constant observations represent only a small percentage of the forcing of the climate. So the biggest forcing on the present climate is due to this is the balance on these phenomena, which are well known and can be explained on the basis of physical laws. So this is what we observe. So why do we worry? But we worry because it's not the first time that the Earth is going to be affected by big temperature variation and climate changes. You see there the effect of the changes of the orbit and the parameters of the orbit of the Earth. But what we worry because suddenly in the 20th century, we have this big increase, which no observation in the past, since 400,000 years, has been observed. So there is something new, and something new is that we are creating the heat in the atmosphere. So what we do not know and what we are not sure about is how this will evolve. This is true. We cannot say that it will evolve so much, and so there are models. In order to forecast the future, you use models. As we use models to describe the sun, we use models to describe the variation of the climate. And following the various assumptions that you make on the kind of energy that you are using, the number of coal or barrels of oil that you are burning every day, the increase in the population, you have several models. And this is used by the IPCC, the experts in the climate change, to forecast the future, and you have seen these various assumptions. So depending upon the assumption, we can say that probably if the trend follows what it does now at 3 millimeters per year, at the end of the 21st century, the sea level will be about 30 centimeters higher than it is today, but maybe we are already above that the most pessimistic assumptions. So UV, I don't want to say that, may affect the circulation of the atmosphere, especially in northern Europe, and explain why Europe is more often affected by cold weather than the rest of the continental areas. I cannot dwell too much on that. And also the role of cosmic rays on the formation of clouds has been followed experimentally at CERN, with the result that indeed the cosmic rays can generate the formation of clouds, but these clouds and the particles inside the clouds are not of the nature which are able to really have a cooling effect or warming effect on the Earth. So these experiments are still continuing to better understand the role of solar activity and the role of the sun on the variation of the climate, but not on the sudden variation of the climate that we are witnessing, but on the longer term. So it's basic research going on. So space weather, you all know this. I will not go too far on that, but let me just summarize that recent report of the U.S. Academy of Sciences in the States. In 2008, estimated that 10 billion of US dollars are essentially lost due to the perturbations of the sun on the various systems that we are using in our modern civilization. GPS, system of navigations, big metallic structures, and the pipelines in particular, telecommunication satellites, all the technology that we are using in modern civilization, which our ancestors did not use, are affected by space weather. So conclusions for this tour of the sun in 1 hour. Let me see. Solar observations from space really have contributed enormously to uncover new faces. I hope you have been convinced of that in aspects of our star. It's flabbergasting the progress that we have made in the past 50 years. They confirmed the solar model and contributed to solve the enigma of the missing neutrinos. This is a nice result. They have revolutionized our views on the sun's magnetism, as I've shown, thanks to our friends from Lockheed and their fellow scientists. It seems, I'm prudent here, that we are now approaching the solution of the mysterious hot corona, but we are not yet there. And they offer a comprehensive view of all manifestations of solar activity, as you've seen, that was not available before the space age. The violence of these manifestations exerts considerable effects on our Earth and on our civilization, and the economic and technical importance of all developments of a comprehensive fleet manifestation of space weather calls for the development of a set of satellites. As you can see here, many nations are developing such satellites to observe the sun. They are also developing satellites to observe the fluctuation of the conditions in the heliosphere and the effect of solar activity on other planets. So it's a large number of satellites developed by Europe, by the United States, by Russia, by China, by Japan, and by some members of ESA individually, Canada, Germany, Belgium, and France. So I think this is a remarkable set of instruments, but it needs to be seen that we have everything that we need to properly understand the effect of space weather, as it is called. So we now know that the model we established of the sun is correct, and that its brightness, the brightness of the sun, will increase by 1% every 100 million years, which means that in 1 billion years it will have increased by 10%. When the surface brightness will be 10% higher than it is today, the Earth will be in the same condition that Venus was a few billion years ago. And the temperature of Venus was so affected by the sun that it became hot, essentially also due to the combined effect of the greenhouse effect, and water was dissociated. So Venus became completely dry because hydrogen could not recombine with oxygen because hydrogen was destroyed by the UV radiation, and water vapor disappeared, with the impossibility to recreate water conditions, humid conditions on Venus. So the Earth will probably, in 1 million years, be following the same trend. So This is a long time, so don't worry, we still can listen to other speeches and highlight lectures. So I would like at this moment to say that studying the sun, as you have probably been convinced, is essential for forecasting its behavior and the condition of its behaviors on our activities, and to also decipher the effect of anthropogenic activities from the natural activities of the sun itself. So I would like to acknowledge my friend Alan Title, who provided me with the beautiful movies that you have seen on the screen concerning magnetic field. His colleague Karel Schreiber, a remarkable scientist also. Saku Tsuneta-san from Japan, who has been providing me with the Hinode observations. And of course the SOHO MDO stereo teams who have been working hard and still work hard to provide this beautiful data. So thank you for your attention. The sun has been also the reason why Monet has painted this picture and created Impressionism. So I hope you have a good impression of the sun. Thank you very much.